Good morning. Welcome to the 48th Annual Sherman Hoslett Memorial Lecture. My name is Dawn Redding. I'm an associate professor here in the biology department, which sponsors the Hoslett Lecture series. Each year at homecoming, we honor the memory of Sherman Hoslett by inviting distinguished graduates of Luther to share their scientific work with us in a formal lecture. A mammologist by training, Sherman was also a distinguished Luther graduate who returned to teach biology and influenced students here at his alma mater. The lecture series, now in its 48th year, is supported by the Hoslett Memorial Endowment Fund. This fund also supports the Hoslett Museum of Natural History, which is located in this building and will be open after the lecture, and the field biology program here at Luther. The complete list of the 48 Hoslett speakers appears in your brochure, and at this time, I would ask if there are any past Hoslett speakers in the audience to please stand so that way we can recognize you. A reminder for any biology students here for colloquium that there are forms up here to be sure to get one. Now I would like to turn things over to Luther biology student Eliza Edlund, who is going to introduce this year's Hoslett speaker.
Hello, as Dr. Redding mentioned, my name is Eliza and I'm a senior biology major here at Luther. This morning I have the pleasure to welcome you to our Hoslett Memorial Lecture by Dr. Karen Hansen, Associate Professor of Rheumatology and Endocrinology at the University of Wisconsin, Madison School of Medicine and Public Health, Dr. Hansen graduated with a degree in biology from Luther in 1989, after which she went on to graduate from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine. Following medical school, she did her residency in internal medicine at the University of Wisconsin. She did her fellowship training at Duke University Medical Center, and in 2001, she joined the teaching faculty of the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. Currently, her research is focused on osteoporosis and vitamin D and calcium absorption. Being back at Luther is very special to her, as she met her now husband in organic chemistry lecture at Luther. And one of their first dates was actually in this lecture hall watching the movie The Wiz. Today she will be presenting Vitamin D, Supersize Me, in which she will discuss some of her recent research in vitamin D absorption. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hansen back to Luther.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. That was very kind of you. I like to pace, and I also have a soft voice. So please do signal me if you can't hear me or if I'm pacing too much and there's feedback in the room. But thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's truly an honor, and thinking back to my belongings here or my beginnings here, it's just very exciting for us. I was the oldest of 5 children born to my parents, and all the way through our childhood we were told, you are going to college no matter what. And so I was the first child in either side of my family, my mom's and my dad's side, to go to college. And we all 5 of us kids went to college. And Luther is where it began for me. So I had this dream in 8th grade to become a doctor, and as I looked around for places to apply, Luther's students had a very high acceptance rate into medical school, and so this is one of the reasons I came here. I also was influenced by the beautiful Christmas window decorations, because I toured the campus at Christmas time and just fell in love with the beauty of this place. And I just wanted to call out some special people in my life. Russ Roulan, who was the biology lecturer while I was going through, and also my mentor for pre-medical classes, and Professor Marion Kaler, who was teaching molecular biology. And then, of course, Wendy Stevens, John Chostam, and Phil Reitan were really important to my husband and I, too, for all their wonderful teaching. You know, Luther College friends last a lifetime, and I just want to share with you this kind of story about my husband and I dating. And these are his 3 male friends, and they had this club called the FOD Club. And FOD is, should I say it? No. FOD means fuck off and die. So to be part of the club, you had to have invited a person on a date, and they had to tell you FOD. So I was part of that club, and we still get together yearly. And Pastor Glesney is a Luther College grad. Yes, this is Pastor Glesney's son, who is now much taller, but he's at one of those super churches in Bloomington, Illinois, where they have 4 services every weekend. Michael Flitty is a CFO in Seattle, and Steve Quick managed a number of businesses, and now he's a stay-at-home dad. So we still see each other, and my husband and I are celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary in December. So, and then just a quick thing about what happens when you add Karen and Mike is you get Henry and Rosalind. These are our children, and my daughter Rosalind is here with me today. So you've already heard kind of the story of my where I've been, and so what I'd like to do is launch into my lecture now. So I would like to really impart to the students in the audience some of the key ingredients to good scientific research. So the first ingredient is having an interest in a topic coupled with a healthy dose of skepticism. In other words, read everything and take it with a grain of salt. And the other thing is to remember that association can only suggest but not prove a cause-effect relationship. An example, people with depression have lower vitamin D levels. Okay, that may be true, but the faulty assumption would be therefore low vitamin D levels cause depression. The next thing I'd like to impart to the students here is whenever possible, when you're looking at literature or doing your own research, try to use the gold standard method to prove a relationship between an intervention and an outcome. In medical science, that is a randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial. But if you're doing a vitamin D assay, you could say, well, what's the best way to measure vitamin D levels? Well, it's high-performance liquid chromatography. So, and then whenever possible, when you're looking at science, try to look at hard outcomes rather than surrogate outcomes to prove a benefit of an intervention. A really good example in my world is that the FDA approved fluoride to treat osteoporosis, and this was based on the surrogate outcome that fluoride increased bone mineral density. Well, it was widely used in the 1990s, and clinicians, doctors caring for patients, started to observe that some of their patients who started fluoride were breaking more bones. And then it became apparent that fluoride actually causes osteomalacia, which is the form of adult rickets. And so now the FDA will no longer approve an osteoporosis drug until there's a clinical trial with fracture as the outcome. So we've learned the hard way, but this is really my major message, and you'll hear it again at the end. So I want to talk to you a little bit about osteoporosis because that's how I got involved in vitamin D research. So if you think about osteoporosis, it's extremely common. And once we reach the age of 50, about half of white women and about 1 in 5 white men will have an osteoporotic fracture. When they break a bone, that's not a pleasant experience. In fact, after a hip fracture, about 20% of men die, and a number of people can't walk without assistance after a hip fracture. And then with hip and vertebral fractures, there's a higher risk of death in the next 5 years. Vertebral fractures are the most common form of osteoporotic fracture, and just look at the rising incidence as we get older. And most of us are expected to live into our 80s now, projected from the improvements in medical care. Now, one of the things that could inform us in terms of reducing this astoundingly common disease is to think about how we can promote mineralization of bone. So, believe it or not, your bones are changing over the year. You're turning over bone continuously. And there's a process where Osteoclasts come in and break down bone, and then osteoblasts come in and fill the hole. As the osteoblasts are working, they form a collagen matrix, and that collagen matrix must mineralize, and the mineralization requires adequate calcium and phosphorus. So, vitamin D is important in maintaining adequate calcium balance. And the way that we get vitamin D is sunshine hits our skin and converts a provitamin D to a previtamin D, which isomerizes to D3, and in the circulation is rapidly converted by the liver to a storage form called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And then you can get some vitamin D from vitamin D fortified milk and fatty fish, but mainly it's sunshine. So then once we have our storage form of vitamin D, there's a tightly regulated step wherein the kidney converts vitamin D to its biologically active form called calcitriol, or 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. And vitamin D then helps us to increase calcium absorption, and then high doses actually increase osteoclast bone resorption, and we might have time to talk about that at the end. So the bottom line is that if you have vitamin D deficiency and or low calcium intake, you have a decline in your intestinal calcium absorption. That drops the ionized serum calcium, and then remember those 4 parathyroid glands in your neck. Their sole purpose is to regulate serum calcium within this narrow range of normal. And so when they see a drop in ionized calcium, they release their parathyroid hormone, and that really does 2 things. It goes to bone, and it upregulates the osteoclast to release calcium from the skeleton. Beautiful process. It keeps the blood calcium normal. It also increases the renal synthesis of bioactive vitamin D to increase calcium absorption. Great system in the short term, but over the long haul, prolonged vitamin D deficiency or reduced calcium intake with reduced calcium absorption causes either osteoporosis or osteomalacia. So what do we know from existing literature on the recommended vitamin D intake to keep our bones healthy? And I just put this slide up because there's just all across the board opinions. So the Endocrine Society says 30 nanograms and higher is optimal for bone health. The Institute of Medicine, which is that group of scientists that establishes recommended daily allowances for our vitamins, says 20 nanograms and higher is fine. And then a committee called the United States Preventive Task Force. They're the groups that tell us how often to get our mammograms, colonoscopies, pap smears, et cetera. They say we don't know the optimal vitamin D blood level for bone health. So what are we to do? And likewise, recommended vitamin D intake, really high doses recommended by the Endocrine Society, moderate doses by Institute of Medicine, and United States Preventive Task Force says there's just not enough evidence for us to say anything about vitamin D intake. Well, again, we've got 1 in 2 women and 1 in 5 men having an osteoporotic fracture. So this is a huge public health problem, and really it's not a good situation that we don't know what to tell our population. Well, why do we have such vastly different opinions about vitamin D intake and levels? Well, if you look at the literature, few studies actually recruited patients who had low vitamin D levels. Even fewer achieved a certain target vitamin D level with intervention. And if you look at the clinical trials, most of them combined calcium and vitamin D and compared that combination to placebo. So it becomes very hard to tease out what to do here. So there's a number of ways we can look at vitamin D and health outcomes. And we could say, well, in population studies, what's the lowest parathyroid hormone level that we can see with a certain vitamin D level or intake? Or we could say, what's the optimal vitamin D level that promotes calcium absorption? What's the optimal level or intake that promotes bone mineral density? Or really the hard outcome of what vitamin D level reduces fall or fractures. So I decided to work on this project, and I had to learn how to measure calcium absorption. Just a quick, we ingest around 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day, and about 20% is absorbed through the gut. And then when it gets into the bloodstream, most all of it is recycled by the kidneys and saved into serum rather than going out in the urine. And there are some studies talking about calcium absorption and bone density. And one study was very small, only 70 women, half premenopausal, and most had normal vitamin D levels at baseline, found that there was no relationship between an increase in calcium absorption and changes in bone mineral density. The best study we have is the study of osteoporotic fractures, which is a prospective cohort trial of almost 5,000 postmenopausal women. And in that study, there was a positive association between femoral neck, bone mineral density, and calcium absorption. And that's important because when we assess a patient's risk of fracture in clinic, we use the femoral neck bone mineral density in our calculation tool. So one would say, okay, if there's a positive association between calcium absorption and bone density in the hip, that would theoretically then reduce the chance of breaking a bone. So I don't know if you guys like Monty Python, but I kind of use this slide to kind of say, well, why did a bunch of people jump on the bandwagon and say vitamin D levels over 30 are the best thing since sliced bread? Well, it came from some work that a legend in nutrition published, and Dr. Robert Haney really, truly established a large amount of wonderful work and was recognized by both Congress and the Institute of Medicine for his incredible work in nutrition and osteoporosis. But late in his career, he published a study that wasn't really done very well. And I'll explain why. But he basically looked at two groups of postmenopausal women in two different trials who had serum calcium blood levels measured as an inferring way to judge their calcium absorption. In one group, they had higher vitamin D levels, and in the other, they had lower vitamin D levels. And from the serum calcium measurement, he claimed there was a 73% increase in calcium absorption with high levels of vitamin D. Well, what are the problems with this study? Remember the skepticism that you have to hold with you as you go through literature. So intestinal calcium absorption was measured using serum calcium levels. That's not a good way to measure calcium absorption. The study was a post hoc analysis of two prior studies done in different populations and with differing eligibility criteria. And just to tell you that the best way to measure calcium absorption is to give an intravenous calcium tracer, an oral calcium tracer, measure urine calcium levels for 24 hours, and then use a fancy formula to figure out the calcium absorption in that individual. And in fact, Haney himself said, don't use blood calcium levels to measure absorption, because it's such a crude measure because calcium is so tightly regulated by parathyroid hormone levels, et cetera. So I decided to do a pilot study in which we recruited women past menopause because I was really interested in osteoporosis. And we wanted to look at people who had vitamin D levels that were low. So we used a high-performance liquid chromatography assay, the gold standard assay, to measure vitamin D blood levels. And then they had to have not really high calcium absorption because there's a passive absorption of calcium through the gut and an active vitamin D-mediated absorption. And I wanted to be sure that I was really studying vitamin D-mediated calcium absorption. We pulled out women who might be harmed by high-dose vitamin D because they had high urine calcium or serum calcium, had kidney stones. We excluded women who couldn't absorb calcium anyway because they had a chronic intestinal condition. And we excluded people with kidney disease whose kidneys may not be able to convert vitamin D to its biologically active form. So then these women agreed to 2 inpatient calcium absorption studies. The first one, they had low vitamin D levels, and the second one, they were vitamin D replete. And again, they had the gold standard method of measuring calcium absorption with an oral and an intravenous tracer, and these are stable calcium isotopes, so their atomic weight is just a little bit different than most of calcium on Earth, which is atomic weight 40. I think you can see it somewhere in the table up there. And then we also asked them to fill out 7-day food diaries so that when they were inpatient, we would replicate their normal dietary habits. So we weren't changing anything except for their vitamin D blood level between the studies. We defined vitamin D repletion as a level over 35 nanograms, and we quickly raised vitamin D levels by giving ergocalciferol, 50,000 IU a day for about 2 weeks. I was lucky to find a guy on campus who had a high-performance liquid mass spectrometry, and then we used a fancy calculator to figure out calcium absorption. Our patient population was 18 women, about 60 years old, body mass index about 30, and most of them had normal bone density. Calcium intake was about 830 milligrams, and their vitamin D levels were low, according to the Endocrine Society, at about 21 nanograms with normal parathyroid hormone. So this is just, they came in and met me on the research ward at 7 o'clock and got their calcium tracers with breakfast, and then stayed on the research ward, and every drop of urine was collected. We called it liquid gold because the calcium tracers cost about $6,000 a dose. So anyway, so this is the way you calculate calcium absorption for those of you who would like to know that. And this is what we found. So vitamin D levels at baseline were about 20 and rose to over 60 nanograms, so no doubt they were vitamin D replete. And calcium absorption did go up by around 3% with that high-dose vitamin D therapy. So this pilot study allowed me to obtain an NIH grant to do a much larger placebo-controlled clinical trial. And so what we did is we recruited postmenopausal women who had vitamin D insufficiency, and we randomized them to 1 year of placebo, a low-dose vitamin D, which is 800 IU, or a high-dose vitamin D, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. Our primary study outcome was to look at calcium absorption because that is the primary physiologic purpose of vitamin D therapy. But we also wanted to look at how changes in calcium absorption corresponded to changes in bone mineral density, muscle mass, and 2 tests of muscle function. The timed up and go test, which is where you have somebody sit at a chair, stand up and walk 10 feet, and then turn around and sit back down again. And that test score predicts falls. And then the 5 sit to stand test, which is where you have somebody sit in a chair and stand and sit 5 times in a row as fast as they can. And that, again, has been linked to risk of falling. And then, of course, we counted falls throughout the trial. Because the point of falls is that if you fall, that's a chance for you to break a bone. Almost every osteoporotic fracture occurs from falling. So that is a meaningful clinical outcome. So again, we recruited women with vitamin D insufficiency who were at least 5 years past menopause because we didn't want to study the rapid drop in bone mineral density that happens in the menopause transition. And we excluded women who were over 76 because once we get to that age, we just have a fall in calcium absorption that doesn't seem to be all that easily reversed with vitamin D therapy. This is kind of a repetitive slide in the sense that we excluded people similar to the pilot study. So we excluded people who might be harmed by the participation because they had high blood calcium or kidney stones. We excluded diabetes because that has a unique metabolic effect on bones. We excluded people with recent cancer because that also affects bone health. We excluded people who couldn't absorb calcium because of a pre-existing gastrointestinal disease, people who had impaired kidney function where they couldn't convert vitamin D to its biologically active form, people taking a whole bunch of vitamin D already, people who should be treated for their osteoporosis based on a screening bone density or because they'd had a fragility fracture, and also people who were taking bone active medications because we don't want to study the effect of those drugs in our trial. We want to study the effects of vitamin D in our trial. So we powered the study to find with 90% power to see a 3% change in calcium absorption between high dose and placebo arm, and 80% power to find a 3% change between high and low dose vitamin D. And if data was normal, we used analysis of variance, and for skewed data, we used a Kruskal-Wallis rank sum test. And because this was a big trial with lots of clinical outcomes, we had to think about our false discovery rate. So if you have a p-value of less than 0.05, any student remember what the probability of finding a false positive is? I know you haven't had this in stats yet, because so it's actually, if you use a p-value of less than 0.05, you have a 1 in 20 chance of just finding a significant p-value just by chance alone. So when you're doing, 100 p-values, you have to correct your p-value and make it much lower in order to be solid about your conclusions. So the paper got published in JAMA, and this is what we did. So we put out ads in the local newspapers and the shopper stoppers, and we sent letters to people in study registries, and over 2,500 people were interested. We were able to reach almost all of those individuals and then excluded them based on the slide you saw earlier. We had a face-to-face screening visit with about 900 people, women, and then at their first screening visit, they were excluded because vitamin D level too high, too low, on a medication not allowed, too high calcium intake. And then at their second screening visit, we excluded another group of women because they had osteoporosis on their bone density test. So that left us with 230 women who were randomized into the trial. So this is how it worked out. We had equal numbers of people in placebo, low and high dose vitamin D. And this was a very devoted group of women. We only had 9 out of those 230 women have to drop out of the trial. And so it was incredible that we had a very high retention rate, and almost everybody had all data for the outcomes. Everyone had data for calcium absorption, and I think there was 1 or 2 who weren't able to do muscle outcome tests because of injuries. So we have a wonderful research pharmacy group at the University of Wisconsin, and they stratified women into the different arms based on whether calcium intake was high and whether they had hyperparathyroidism at baseline. And then remember that our gold standard for clinical trials is a double-blind study. So there's an incredible bias introduced if a person knows what treatment they're getting during a trial. And so it was a challenge to think through this and say, well, how are we going to double-blind this trial? So in the placebo arm, everyone took a daily white and intermittent yellow tablet, low dose daily white placebo containing 800 international units of vitamin D, and an intermittent yellow placebo. And in the high dose, intermittent yellow, high dose vitamin D, and a daily white placebo. We had a loading dose for the high dose arm. So the high dose arm took 50,000 IU a day for 15 days, and that quickly raised their vitamin D levels, as you'll see in a moment. And then we maintained those high levels of vitamin D with an additional 50,000 international unit tablet every 15 days. And then if somebody in the high dose arm had a vitamin D level that dipped below 30 nanograms, they were redosed. And then, of course, we had to sham adjust some of those yellow placebo tablets in the placebo arm so we could keep our best attempt at blinding. Well, how are you going to keep everybody on track with these complicated pill regimens? So what we did is we bought these 1-month pill boxes, and my study coordinators did a beautiful job of filling the pill boxes and labeling the Mondays, and extra pill falls down the sink, you got an extra pill here. So we would put little signs for, July 4th holiday and somebody's birthday. They were just, my study coordinators were fabulous. So everybody got these pill boxes throughout the 1 year of this trial. And we counted those pills to see how well people adhered to the treatment, and our adherence was about 100%. So pretty darn good. I don't know you can get much better than 100%. So now moving to the characteristics of the women in our trial. They were about 61 years old, body mass index about 31, mostly white, and with normal bone mineral density. And the important thing is there's no significant difference in the baseline characteristics across the treatment arms, which is very important. So if you think about this, if there was a significant difference, let's say we had more African Americans in one treatment arm, well, they are more efficient at absorbing calcium just from the get-go. That might skew our study results and lead to faulty conclusions. So it was wonderful that these were all characteristics that were well matched across the arms. Likewise, baseline dietary habits, including calcium intake from diet and supplements, was not significantly different across treatment arms, nor was any intake of macronutrients or micronutrients. And then if we look at baseline laboratory data, very nice matching across treatment arms, particularly the vitamin D level was 21 nanograms in everybody on average. Normal parathyroid hormone levels, no significant difference in the bioactive vitamin D levels or the estradiol levels. Okay. And so this is what happened with vitamin D levels in the trial. So with a high-dose vitamin D regimen, that was 50,000 IU a day for 15 days. Then by 30 days into the trial, we had these really high blood levels of vitamin D in the high-dose arm, and they kept above 30 nanograms throughout the trial, which is exactly what we wanted to do. And then with the placebo arm, a little dip in vitamin D levels over the 1 year of participation, and the low dose came up just a little bit. Okay, so now we get to the meat of the talk, or the meat of the results. I think I'm talking faster than I needed to. Okay, sorry about that. I get excited and I just go fast. So this is looking at just baseline and 1 year calcium absorption by treatment arm, placebo dropping, low dose dropping, and high dose increasing a little bit. And so high dose 1, we looked at baseline calcium absorption as a controlling factor in our models because, of course, we're more efficient absorbing calcium when we're younger, and we're more efficient if our calcium intake is a little bit higher at baseline because of that passive absorption. So again, high-dose vitamin D arm had a small increase in calcium absorption to the tune of 1%. So remember Dr. Haney saying a 73% increase in calcium absorption with his study using serum calcium area under the curve? Well, we didn't get that. We had a 1% increase and a little dip in the other arms. At the end of the trial, we looked at whether there were any changes in dietary habits that could account for that finding, and we didn't find any difference. So p-value is not significantly different, and especially for calcium intake, no difference. And then looking at the changes in bone density, no difference across treatment arms in changes in the lumbar spine bone density, the total hip bone density. There was a little excitement with femoral neck bone density, but then when we adjusted for our thousands of p-values in this trial, we found, okay, that was disappointing too. And then total body, no significant difference in the change in bone density over this 1 year clinical trial. Then, of course, we talked about earlier, it's important to look at muscle outcomes, and unfortunately, no benefits of high-dose vitamin D on the sit to stand, the timed up and go, muscle mass, falls, or number of fallers in this trial. What about safety? Well, I mean, really the only signal we saw for safety with this high-dose vitamin D regimen was a little rise in urine calcium levels, but that didn't translate into any kidney stone events, and it didn't translate into anything else. No difference in falls, no difference in fractures, no difference of infection, hospitalization, or death. So I don't have, this is not my last slide. I have a few more things to say. But in summary, we found that correction of vitamin D insufficiency with a high-dose vitamin D regimen did increase calcium absorption, but the effect was pretty small, only 1%. And it didn't translate into other clinical outcomes like changes in bone density, risk of falling, tests of muscle function. So a little bit disappointing. If we go back to these recommendations, our study recruited people with a baseline vitamin D level about 21 nanograms and found no clinical benefits of high or low dose vitamin D compared to placebo. So the Institute of Medicine seems to be right in the middle of what groups recommend. And the Institute of Medicine said, goal vitamin D is about 20 nanograms, and you achieve that by getting 600 to 800 international units of vitamin D a day. And our study really kind of fell in the middle and agreed with that summary. So Professor Robert Haney, again, the legend of osteoporosis and nutrition research, says the requirement for a nutrient is determined by the point at which further increases in the nutrient don't offer benefits to an individual. And so going back to the legend himself, the argument is that getting above 20 nanograms really didn't offer any clinical benefits. Okay, so maybe less is more. So I want to kind of go back to this whole initial message I wanted to share with the students in the room that, remember, good science starts with interest, but also a really big dose of skepticism as you read the literature. And just keep in mind that when you see these association studies, they suggest but can't prove causation. Try to use your gold standard techniques when you're looking at the literature to prove a relationship between an intervention and an outcome, and wherever possible, require a hard outcome to prove the benefits. And this is I just went searching on the internet on Friday, that was yesterday, to look at kind of another example of this. And the Vitamin D Council is talking about depression and vitamin D. And they said, we all feel fed up, miserable, and sad sometimes in our lives. If you develop clinical depression, these feelings don't improve. Does vitamin D help with depression? Low vitamin D levels are common in people with depression, and some studies show that high-dose vitamin D is helpful to improve depression. And if you have depression, we recommend taking high-dose vitamin D. Doses 5,000, 10,000 IU a day. You might even want to take 20,000 IU a day. So I said, well, okay, I'm a skeptic. I'm going to go and see what I can find about this topic. So I went to PubMed, which is a peer-reviewed search of the literature, and I typed in vitamin D, depression, and I wanted to look at randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials. And I excluded people that were like subgroups of diabetes, but I just picked out a couple trials. And I didn't find that the literature really supported these claims. So this was a study where they took people with they took people with depression, not necessarily having vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency, but they did give them a placebo or a vitamin D supplement, and the supplement didn't improve scores for depression. This is another trial where they recruited people who had bipolar depression and they did have vitamin D deficiency, and they gave them a pretty good dose of vitamin D, 5,000 IU a day for 12 weeks, or placebo, and they used some validated scales to measure depression. And at the end, there was no significant difference between treatment arms. Both treatment arms had improvements in their assessments of depression, but no benefit of vitamin D over placebo. So again, skepticism, don't believe association studies, use gold standard techniques, and hard outcomes when you can. And I just want to thank people for their attention. I know I went really fast. So, and I will take any questions at this point. Yes.
In your study, did you control
So the question is, did I control for sunlight exposure? So we actually, thank you for bringing that up. We did, and I didn't say that in the slides, but we used a sunscreen called Total Block, which has a zinc and titanium oxide. It's more of a chemical, I'm sorry, it's not a chemical sunscreen, it's a physical sunscreen. And we use that instead of the PAVA-based sunscreen because PAVA-based sunscreen or chemical sunscreen causes allergies in about 8 to 10% of the American population. And so we gave them vitamin D or Total Block sunscreen throughout the clinical trial. It was hard to measure adherence to that, but if you look at the vitamin D blood levels across treatment arms, they did clearly differ. So it seems that it probably did something to keep people from getting vitamin D replete just from sun alone. Question there?
Kind of related to that, people as they age probably spend a lot less time outside, and for people who don't spend any time outside, do they need vitamin D supplement?
Okay, good point. So you're asking if people who are older spend less time outside, and if so, should they all take a vitamin D supplement? So the Institute of Medicine has recommended that we all take 600 international units of vitamin D, and if we're 70 or older, that we pop that up to 800 international units of vitamin D. And that is the recommended daily allowance. Now, I mentioned earlier that the United States Preventive Task Force has looked at the same literature and said there's not enough scientific evidence to recommend that universally for all Americans, but I think that it's very safe to take that low dose of vitamin D and it's not going to hurt you. Question back there.
In terms of screening the people in your trial, did you consider eating disorders and whether that would influence the vitamin D?
So did we consider eating disorders in our clinical trial? So I did not specifically exclude people with anorexia nervosa or bulimia. And I guess in meeting these women, they were well nourished. They weren't, in general, weren't of low body mass index. So I think that it's probably not a significant factor in the trial, but it's a good point. Question back there in the.
Thank you for your presentation, and it's impressive that you were able to get 230 people to volunteer for a year.
Yeah, they were wedded to the study. They were part of our study team.
A question in regards to falls. You mentioned falls as if they were just sort of, okay, fall down, get up.
Yeah.
Did anyone get injured in these falls?
We did have a couple people have injuries during falls, yes. But the rate of falling was no different between the treatment arms, which, I guess it says, at least there wasn't any harm in this trial with the high-dose vitamin D arm, but there's 2 other trials out there that have reported that high-dose vitamin D actually increased falls. And we don't understand the mechanism by which that occurs, but it's been reported in 2 big placebo-controlled trials now. Let's see. How about you right now?
Some years ago, I know bold claims were made for the benefits of taking vitamin D, not only to prevent loss of bone density, but the belief was that it might prevent a lot of other disorders.
Yes.
MS, breast cancer, other cancers.
Right.
Is there any reason to believe that taking, maybe, what did you say, 800 units of vitamin D again a day might have some preventive benefits?
Okay, so she was saying that there's been some bold and kind of global claims about vitamin D and health, including maybe vitamin D reduces cancer, cardiovascular events. So what I didn't share with you today is a big clinical trial that was just completed called VITAL, V-I-T-A-L, where they looked at vitamin D's effects on cardiovascular events and cancer, and there was no benefit over placebo. So I think, the problem is the press really likes to kind of give us these exciting things that we can just take as a pill and fix all the things that are wrong with us. And we, I think, want to find that magic pill. I mean, and I think that the press really owes us more responsible reporting, and that they should report out placebo-controlled clinical trials rather than these claims that aren't substantiated. So until they do that, and maybe they never will, it's on us to say, what is this claim based on? Is it based on good science, or is it based on some poorly conducted research? Question way in the back.
So when you mentioned the stats for the prevalence of osteoporosis amongst men and women,
Yes.
It was for white.
White.
people. So
Yes.
the question is, do the stats, like, are they the same for people of color, or there hasn't been any study?
No, there's a whole bunch of research on the rate of osteoporotic fracture in all races. And black individuals have the very lowest rate of osteoporosis. It probably relates to their greater efficiency in calcium absorption and the higher peak bone density that they achieve in young adulthood. Then Hispanic and Asian have a higher risk of fracture, but not as high as white people do. So there's some fascinating things that need to be figured out about that whole interplay. But if you can be, if you have African American heritage, you're at low risk of having osteoporosis. Question?
Do you have any future plans for studies on the effects of vitamin D?
Yes, what are my future studies? So I do have a grant in at NIH that's being reviewed later this month to do another clinical trial on the effects of vitamin D in people with chronic kidney disease who have hyperparathyroidism because their kidneys aren't able to convert vitamin D to its biologically active form. So my proposal is to study whether giving biologically active vitamin D improves bone density and muscle function compared to a placebo treatment. So breath, holding my breath, trying not to hold my breath. Question in the back.
I apologize if I don't remember this exactly, but your subjects had clinically low vitamin D?
Yes, they all had to have vitamin D insufficiency by HPLC.
But normal parathyroid hormone?
We didn't exclude people with hyperparathyroidism, but there were only about 3 or 4 in the whole trial of 230 women who had a high parathyroid hormone level.
But nonetheless, wouldn't the low vitamin D predict a higher parathyroid hormone?
Well,
Is there a difference in clinical
yeah,
trials, or?
in my practice, I think that if somebody has low vitamin D and a high parathyroid hormone level, that they have secondary hyperparathyroidism from low vitamin D status. And that's another argument that, maybe 20 nanograms vitamin D is just fine, because really it doesn't commonly associate with hyperparathyroidism. Good question. Oh, what's the level that does? I mean, the lower the vitamin D level, the more likely you'll have hyperparathyroidism. But it also is an interplay with calcium intake, too. So if you have very low calcium intake, you might have a higher vitamin D level at which you would develop hyperparathyroidism because there's simply less calcium coming into the system. Question here.
So exercise is like a way to kind of like counteract like the calcium and the vitamin D in your body, especially in older age. So did you take into account like the different exercise levels of these women?
We did not monitor exercise during this trial. Some trials have done that, and it requires a little sensor that people have to wear a certain amount of the trial. We did not account for that. Question in the back.
Is there any evidence that calcium supplements increase bone density?
So I think we have decent evidence that if you are in negative calcium balance with hyperparathyroidism, that then if you improve the parathyroid hormone levels by either giving more calcium or giving vitamin D, that will increase bone density. But just in the general population, there's not good data that at least calcium supplements reduce risk of fracture by themselves. And so if you're treating somebody with osteoporosis, I mean, when I work at the VA osteoporosis clinic and the university osteoporosis clinic, and so I will always assess calcium intake. And then if they're not in the range of about 1,200 milligrams to 2,000 a day, I'll make sure that they are increasing their calcium intake to stay in neutral calcium balance. Question right here.
So a couple of questions. One, following on to your question, was I've read that strength training and resistance training is particularly well at building bone strength.
Okay.
So I wonder what you know about that. And then the second question, I just want to make sure that I draw accurate conclusions from your findings. So if you get very little, only 1% increased calcium absorption from increased levels of vitamin D intake, would you not, if you have normal levels of vitamin D, there's really no need to take a vitamin D supplement to try to reduce your potential for fractures? Is that, so those are the
Yeah,
questions.
I agree with your summary. Yeah. If you have normal vitamin D levels, then increasing the level higher doesn't really give you any benefit. And your first question was about exercise and bone health. So there's a really good document called Too Fit to Fall or Fracture, which was an evidence-based summary of the literature on exercise and the chance of falling and breaking a bone, falling or breaking a bone. And it gave us kind of a surprise summary, which said, well, for years we just would tell our osteoporosis patients, make sure you walk at least 30 minutes, 5 days a week. But this document that looked at all the clinical trials said strength and balance are the best things to do if you have osteoporosis. And it's because strength and balance training reduce your risk of falling. So if you have osteoporosis, I ask you to practice balance and do strength.
Does the strength training, though, have you read, does it relate to actually making your bones stronger? That's what I've read.
There is a little, there's not a lot of effect on bone density. If you look at the clinical trials, you might find kind of like a 1% increase if you're studying large group of patients. So in a given individual, you wouldn't probably even be able to measure that within the error rate of your measurements of bone density from one year to the next. I really think of it as making your muscles work better so you reduce your chance of falling, because almost every osteoporotic fracture happens from falling. Question there?
I think there's an interesting broader context to this, and that's just the sheer number of supplements and claims about supplements that people are confronted with in their everyday lives.
Right.
And I think your example of the claim about vitamin D and depression is pretty interesting, and that you were able to address that by going to PubMed and looking up clinical trials that looked at this. But that in itself requires a really high amount of scientific literacy
Right.
to approach that. So do you have any advice for just a lay audience on how to approach these claims about supplements in their everyday lives and try and approach some amount of truth
Right.
of what the supplements may or may not be able to do?
So you're saying that, you know, we're bombarded with these ads saying take this supplement, you know, because it'll help your memory, or take that supplement because it'll reduce your chance of breaking a bone or help you feel better. And how should we as a lay press handle these claims? You know, I agree with you. Not everyone, I mean, I would argue that not very many people have the energy, even if they do have the knowledge to go to the literature and search it, they just don't have the time and energy to do it. So, I mean, what are we to do? I mean, I think there are very highly respected groups that give us public recommendations. And one is the United States Preventive Task Force. I mean, they are the gold standard group of experts that say, well, how often do you need a mammogram? How often should you get your colonoscopy? When should we screen for high cholesterol? So if you want to use the United States Preventive Task Force website to really look things up that are related to health, that's a great source. Otherwise, hopefully your doctor can tell you too. Question back there.
More of a comment. One point this summer, I was curious what do different places say about multivitamins. I went to Johns Hopkins, Harvard Public Health, Oregon State University. I think one was clearly a waste of money, don't do it.
Right.
One said, well, it's unclear, probably not going to hurt you, why not do it? The other one was, oh yeah, we think you should do it. And so even public health departments and major universities
Right.
are offering very conflicting advice, presumably based on the same data.
Right. And I wish Wendy Stevens were here in the audience, because she would just say to us, hey, eat healthy, eat in moderation, exercise. I wish she were here to kind of remind us that, what our mom told us is probably the very best thing for us to keep doing. Any last question? Yes. Is there a harm to taking too much vitamin D? That's a great question. It's unusual, but you certainly can get high blood calcium levels from taking very high doses of vitamin D. There were 2 clinical trials that looked at high-dose vitamin D and its effects on falls. And in one, it was highly publicized in JAMA. It was a trial by a woman named Saunders. And she had a clever way of treating people. During the yearly flu vaccine, people participated in the trial by getting either a high-dose vitamin D injection in their arm or getting placebo injection in their arm. And that was a really high bolus of vitamin D. It was 500,000 international units IM. And we don't even have that in this country. This was done in Australia, where they do have that. And it was interesting because this really high bolus of vitamin D, there was a graph saying within about 3 months of that high dose, significant rise in fractures and falls in the high-dose vitamin D arm compared to the placebo arm. And then the argument was, well, we don't even have that formulation of vitamin D in this country. There was another trial done in Germany by Heike Bischoff-Ferrari where she gave a once-a-month high-dose vitamin D compared to placebo, actually saw the same thing, more falls in the high-dose vitamin D arm. And then the NIH just sponsored a big clinical trial in the Hopkins area, and I was part of the Data Safety Monitoring Board for that study. And basically, they were comparing placebo. The placebo arm was 400 international units of vitamin D compared to 1,000, 2,000, or 4,000 international units of vitamin D. And it was one of these study designs where within a certain period of time, after a certain number of fall events, there would be a choice of which of those 3 vitamin D doses continued on in the trial. It's called a Bayesian study design. And so we, as a Data Safety Monitoring Board, noticed that the 2,000 and the 4,000 IU vitamin D doses were falling more than the 1,000. So the 1,000 was chosen as, quote, the winner to continue through the trial. And then at the end of the trial, which I think they're submitting the manuscript this week to New England Journal, but basically there was no difference in falls between those 2 arms, which is 400 IU a day, the placebo arm, and the 1,000. So, if you want to take a vitamin D supplement, I just think you're going to be safe taking 600 to 800 international units a day. I don't know that you need to take more. And there's a little bit of concern that maybe more might increase your chance of falling.
Okay, well, thank you for